Why do we need a kohen to be the one to break the news to somebody that they have tzaras? It's a very powerful lesson about how we deal with people, especially people who are in a difficult spiritual position. Betumas negoim, matzin shnei dinim klolim, the two general principles that apply to the impurity of tzaras. The first is Aleph Re'iyas Hanega Likvoya Im Hanega Tomei Oloi Muchrachas Lios Alidei Chacham. Firstly, you need a Chacham, somebody who is wise and familiar with Torah law, in order to determine whether or not the particular blemish that the person has is tzaras and therefore impure. And a Chacham is Sheirenu Rabbi V'Yebaki B'Chol HaNegoim V'Shmoisem B'Niga Adam Kulam B'Niga B'Godim U'B'Niga Botim, somebody who is well schooled and has been trained in knowing how to identify the various blemishes that appear on people, clothing, or homes. That Chacham does not have to be a kohen, it just has to be a knowledgeable person. The halacha is any person who has the qualifications can identify the various blemishes. But then, that's the biology of it. But whether or not the person is in a state of purity or impurity, that has to be determined by a kohen. Meaning, even after the Chacham has given his expert opinion and said, this is one of the impure forms of blemish, the person is not in a state of tumah until a kohen tells him, you're impure. But the same applies later when he has to be purified. Even if it's a person or a garment that has now been cleansed of the particular blemish, that person remains in a state of tumah until a kohen tells him, you're good, you're now pure. Now this fact that the kohen's statement is the predetermining factor of whether he's impure or pure. In other words, that the kohen, his statement will determine whether or not the person is now in a state of purity or not. That it is so much part of the process, even a kohen who doesn't know how to identify what a blemish even looks like. Even if the kohen is underage or not of sound mind, we bring the kohen, tell him, you rely on the expert opinion of this chacham, all you need to do is say the words. The chacham sees the blemish, and tells the kohen, say this word, you are impure. And the kohen tells him he's tummy, and at that point he's tummy. Likewise, if he doesn't know how to tell that the tzaras is ended, the chacham guides him, and he says the word toher. Now that really needs explanation. First of all, because in many of these scenarios, the kohen is completely reliant on the words and insight and wisdom of the chacham. So why do we need the kohen to make his statement for? His statement is just purely words. Second of all, Bays, why is there something unique about somebody with tzaras? That it's specifically in this case of tumah, because there are various other kinds of tumah. And over here, the Torah gives us this unique approach, that the pure or impure status of this individual is completely dependent on the kohen. Why here? Even though you say, well, that's what the Torah decided, and you can't question the Eibishter's decrees. How do you do Mashakos of a Rambam? We know what the Rambam tells us. Even those parts of the Torah that are designed to be super rational, you're supposed to contemplate them. And the Rambam says, to the extent that you can explain it, you should. Especially if the reason is going to be something that helps us get our behavior right, our minds right. As the Rambam tells us, the majority of Torah is to fix our mind, to put us on the straight and narrow in terms of our behavior, or to paraphrase from the pasuk, that the Eibishter instructed us, as all of these super rational laws, that we should come to fear Hashem. In other words, if we're not necessarily going to understand the exact reasoning of this particular mitzvah, at least we should know what it teaches us about how to stand with Yirah Shamayim. So, this great innovative insight that the kohen is the one who's going to decide if a material is pure or not, that is expressed not as clearly at the end of the process when the kohen announces, okay, you're now finished the tzaras and you're pure again. And where you see it most glaring is that the Kohen has to pronounce the person with tzaras as impure. Because if you think about it, you can only reach the point where you have to purify somebody from tzaras if you gotten to the point that they were impure with tzaras, and that is completely contingent on the Kohen. So you see that the Kohen is the basis for this entire process of tzaras, including the purification that follows. For which reason it is logical to say the fact that the Kohen has to be the one who gives the person the all clear, that is actually a result of the fact that only the Kohen could make him Tomei in the first place. In other words, because the state of Tumah was generated by the words of the Kohen, therefore the only way out of this impurity is with a statement by a Kohen as well. And the only thing is that actually makes our question even greater. If the whole chap was that the Kohen can alleviate the Tumah, I can understand. Okay, now I know why a Kohen should be doing this, allowing the person back into society. Because a Kohen is intrinsically related to the concept of purity. Because remember, Kohen has to avoid tumah at all costs, so his life is a life of tara, of purity, so he can invoke purity for somebody. And therefore it would make logical sense that the Kohanim are responsible for sharing purity with the Jewish people. Therefore the Kohen should be the one to release him back into society. That makes sense. But for exactly that reason, that's why we should have the question, why would you call on a Kohen whose entire life is centered on purity and make him the only person who can designate a Matzorah as Tameh? Doesn't seem to make sense. So a beautiful explanation that Rabbi gives is, yes, there are many types of impurity, but there's something about a Matzorah that is so strict, it is harsher than all the other tumas, which is, he has to be isolated and quarantined outside of the camp. Which means we send him out of all of the Jewish habitat, all three camps. And even when he's out of the three camps, he has to be in quarantine. Even other people who are tameh for other reasons may not be in his proximity. Meaning, there's something really harsh happening with the Matzorah that is pushed outside not only of the healthy part of the Jewish community, but even the people who are impure, he's pushed away from them. Which illustrates the deeper spiritual meaning behind this impurity of tzaras. It's a tumah chamura kol kach. It's such a heavy kind of impurity. It takes the infected person and isolates them from the entire reality of holiness. It's almost as if temporarily this person's association with the holy Jewish people has been suspended. Therefore the Torah says, hang on a second. Who has the right to designate a Jewish person to belong outside of the camp, outside of the holy environment? Ach verak kohen. The only person who could do that is a kohen. Why? Because in Yonesh ala kohen be'ava. The role of a kohen is to bless the Jewish people, and specifically through love. The designation of a kohen is a person of chesed who gives brachas to the Eden. But dafka be'ava, so specifically when you're in that state of love, as we know that love is a prerequisite to be able to bless the Jewish people as a kohen. They have to bless us with love. To the extent that if the kohen blesses the community lacking that love, could chas v'shalom imperil the kohen. So that's exactly why, because the kohen is the person who is the ultimate paragon of kindness. So that's the only person the Torah can trust to decide that this Jew needs such a radical intervention to be put outside of the camp. Because of that also helps us understand the context and flow of the psukim. Such a strange series of psukim. It says the Kehanim who Hashem chose to serve him and to bless the Eden. It's on their comment that there'll be either the attention to conflict or to nega, which is tzaras. There's this incredible paradox that because they were chosen to bless the Jewish people, therefore they're the ones who can designate a person as having tzaras. It goes without saying, obviously, for a kohen to make a designation of a person, if they're impure, that has to have solid Torah basis. That's why to start this process, we need a chacham, somebody who is well versed in what Torah has to say, and they will identify if this is or is not tzaras. Has to be somebody who is very thoroughly aware of all the various types of negoim. Not only can the person be a genius in their own right, but they have to have a solid tradition from their teacher, got it from their teacher, got it from their teacher, to be able to identify tzaras. So it's well grounded in Torah that this person has tzaras. But when you have to translate that theoretical identification of a blemish into the practical quarantine of a person, for that you need a kohen who exudes absolute love and kindness. Somebody so sensitive, somebody who's so predisposed to kindness, will feel the weightiness of designating somebody as having tzaras and being ousted from the community. Therefore, this person, this kohen, is not going to save any effort, and he's going to drill the chacham to know, did you get the halacha right? And he'll remind him that the job of a beis din, in this case the single chacham, is to judge and save the person. Find the positive. Don't automatically excommunicate somebody. Like we know the expression that there's nobody as wise as somebody who's had experience. One of the explanations of that is that when a person learns through an issue in halacha, knowing that it's going to translate into a practical application, you're going to invest much more and make sure you get to the root of the issue so that you make sure that what you're doing is correct. This will affect lives. Kol shekain, if it's a mitzvah who's going to be sent out of the community. If the kohen has this whole back and forth with the chacham, and is eventually satisfied that the kohen that the kindest member of the community is willing to designate this person as impure, that obviously is the correct way that the Torah wants this case to be ruled. And once the kohen is invested in this case, you can be sure he will spare no effort to find a way to prove that this person is now tahor again, so they can re-enter into society, come almost the case manager of this person with tzaras to help them out. And that teaches us a stunning lesson for ourselves. There's a clear and powerful message. Should we, God forbid, notice something negative in a fellow Jew? Even if we think that somebody has degraded their spirituality to the extent that they've excluded themselves from the community. This person no longer deserves to be in the Jewish community. Their behavior is just too far gone. The Torah warns us. Even if you're the wisest person and the most knowledgeable in the entire Torah, with all of your incredible wisdom and knowledge, you've arrived at the conclusion that this person deserves to be outside of the camp. Before you translate that theory into how you actually behave towards this person, you have to do a real internal audit. Where am I up to in my chesed and avas Yisrael? Do I really care enough about a fellow Jew? And if, God forbid, I am lacking some iota of love for a fellow Jew, in that case, I no longer have the right to determine that Jew has to be excommunicated. Because it's quite likely then that I am not keeping the objective, truthful perspective of Torah, and maybe but rather there's a little bit of my own stuff that I haven't really dealt with that's brought up the bias I have towards this particular individual. Fascinating, but the Torah tells us the actual blemish does not make a person tamei. You have to have the kohen in his perspective of kindness and love saying you're tamei. That will make the metzora tamei. That illustrates to us if a person is not at the ultimate state of chesed, kindness, love for a fellow Jew, who then decides that a Jew deserves to be outside of the community, is obviously telling us an untruth. And in that case, the person who's pointing an accusatory finger at the other Jew is actually the one with tzaras. Tzara is, in a sense, an acronym for moitzi shem ra, somebody who's spreading libel about another Jew. Like the comment of Chazal on that pasuk, this will be the law of the Metzora. This is the law of what happens when a person libels another Jew. In other words, it's not only that this person is speaking negatively about a fellow Jew, because if it was Lashon Hara, the information would have been true. And we know that Tzaras is for Lashon Hara. But the person who is not completely imbued with love of a fellow Jew, who is now deciding that a Jew belongs outside of the community, that person is libeling that fellow Jew, and therefore they themselves deserve tzaras, or have tzaras in a spiritual sense. So how should the person deal with that lack within themselves? Go into quarantine outside of the camp. Remove yourself from communal affairs until you have learned how to look at a Jewish person positively. You got to stay away from the people so you don't harm anybody with your negativity. And when a person has rehabilitated from this particular blemish, the blemish of seeing the negative in a fellow Jew, then they can return, then they can be healed. When we engage with true love and even undeserved love for a fellow Jew, that will neutralize what caused the galus in the first place, which was unfounded hatred. Galus is called hatzarua, a state of quarantine or distance, excommunication. And then automatically and immediately, as a result of our dedication to have absolute love for a fellow Jew, the geula will come through Moshiach immediately.